Chapter 12 of the story is Trials of a King, and that king is King David, who we saw go from being shepherd to king in the previous chapter. And this chapter, chapter 12, begins with the very well-known episode of David and Bathsheba. Talk about trials of a king. In this story, David isn't where he's supposed to be. He should be out with his soldiers and his commanders on the battlefield, but he stays home. He can't sleep one night, so he goes up for a rooftop stroll. On another rooftop nearby, he sees a woman bathing. He should probably look away, but instead he sort of fixes his gaze on her and notices that she's beautiful. He gets his servants involved. We kind of wonder what they think about all this. He asks them who she is, and then he sends some of his messengers to go and get her. Now, right from the beginning, when he says, "Who is that?" they tell him that is Uriah's wife. If you move past this story in the Bible to 2 Samuel 23, you'd see that Uriah is listed among David's special mighty men. Uriah is one of his dependable good men. If you look at that chapter, what you notice is that Uriah is listed last, almost like a little twist of the knife, like it's there for dramatic effect. And Uriah, David should have known better. David knows who Uriah is, and he finds out that this is his wife. Anyway, the story as it plots out is pretty well known. David abuses his kingly power. He sleeps with Bathsheba. She becomes pregnant. David calls Uriah back home from the battle lines, and he's hoping that he'll sleep with his wife, Bathsheba, in order to cover up the fact that this is David's child. Uriah doesn't go for it, so then instead, David's plan B is to plot Uriah's death on the battlefield, and when his commander plays out this plot to get Uriah killed on the battlefield, some of David's other soldiers are killed as well. So there's collateral damage in this sin and cover-up and scheme that David masterminded. And as a result of all this, of what David did, God says to David, "The sword will never leave your family." So here's the first great king of Israel, and already we have got a monarchy with problems. The sword will never leave your family. Now, to David's credit, and we don't want to overlook the egregious sin he committed, but to David's credit, after he sees his egregious offense, and after Nathan the prophet confronts him on it, David says, "I have sinned against the Lord." And David is penitent in a way that his predecessor Saul certainly never was. And surely this penitence and this attitude is part of the reason that David, despite his sin, is called a man after God's own heart. So chapter 12 of the story goes on to show some of the other difficulties that David faces within his family, particularly in the case of his son Absalom, who challenges him for the throne for a while. And then it shows David making all these preparations to begin building God's temple. David knows he won't be the one to build it. God has told him that. It's going to be his son. But towards the end of his reign, David starts to draw all his resources together to make preparations for building God's house. The cloud over chapter 12 might be simply that the monarchy is infected. David, great as he was, succumbed to temptation, adultery, scheming, and murder. And yet, God had promised that David's throne would be established over his people for all time. So in the face of the infection in the monarchy, how are we going to have a Davidic king who can overcome human weakness? Even David wasn't able to do that. Well, the Bible tells us how we can achieve this. It's hundreds of years later, after David, a child from David's line is born, Jesus Christ. He is God incarnate as a common-looking man, an unlikely Davidic king. See, the trials that David faces in chapter 12 of the story are trials he faces for his own sin. But the trials that Jesus faced in his life were trials for the sins of the world, which Jesus came to take away and to restore God's people back to God.